I might be getting hit by my own wife. There you go.
A little hungry, that's why maybe I left food myself.
Okay, so we should be all good to go anytime.
See if we're gonna call some more people in here.
So last had like a small. Yeah. Oh, whatever. No such thing as a small.
Yeah, cost. Oh,
Okay, we should probably get started. Okay, we have until 35.
All right. All right, so big crowd. You guys excited? So I was kind of working on how I'm going to go through like how we connect different things to you agents and stuff. But as I had a lot of conversations with people, what I found might be way more valuable is the practical tools I use in creating that both give me the ability to like look into how I'm creating graphs that are the cognition part of our application and where those potentially become agents in Agentverse. But the way I use my tool set, everything from ngrok as a kind of a proxy that allows you to examine, requests that are coming through to how we visualize graphs that we're building. We're using LangChain and LangGraph, and particularly LangGraph Cloud. And so just the process of how you can go through and work out how you're going to achieve repeatable outcomes in your LLM-based application, right? Because LLMs are very creative, which means I can't always test I'm going to get 3 back. I might get the feeling of 3. I might get the description of 3. The LLMs have a kind of creative way of expressing themselves. And so I've kind of put together a tool set that I'm using on a daily basis that helps my entire team be able to rapidly iterate and create outcomes and then be able to repeat those outcomes. So if that's interesting, it's all about helping you build faster. And then it happens in the context of agents and LLMs and the applications that we're generally focused on using kind of in this day and age. So first thing I'll do is I'll start out with kind of describing the sets of tools I have in play. Because we're using U agents on our tool side. So it's got a tool calling part of our application. This is what describes our application. Have any of you guys ever used LangGraph Studio? Use LangChain to kind of interact. So the idea of LangChain is kind of under the hood. It's got this to have primitive components that can be chained together to create your outcomes. So this idea of runnables that all have an input schema and an output schema, and then you can chain those things together the way you would traditional command line arguments. So if you're familiar with kind of the Unix pipe model, right? You've got a bunch of tools that do little things really well, and then you chain them together to create larger outcomes. So that's LS, right? Just to list files, but you can also then pipe that into word count to see you know, how many words are in there, whatever, you know what I mean? That concept of piping small tools together, which is the fundamental concept of agent first, is to create small agents that do certain things really well and be able to chain those agents together to create self-assembling new emergent capabilities, like an agent that can book hotels really good and an agent that knows all about you and can plan the best vacation for you could work together to actually implement your vacation by chaining them together and having emergent capabilities. So the tools that we use is LangGraph, LangChain. We've got Django and Python as kind of our backend for business logic. We're using Stream Chat to manage that entire chat lifecycle. So they've just got all the tools in place to do large scale deployments. So you're opening up WebSockets from clients, and then you're calling webhooks back to your backends that you can then process off, hand off into the graph to do cognition, and now pop that out the other end and send it right back to Stream Chat so that you now have that interface that's happening that is a chat-based interface, but can scale to kind of any level. It's just the number of celery workers on the Python side you're spinning off, or on the graph, just the number of you know, how you're either vertically or horizontally kind of scaling that with, you know, additional nodes of compute, et cetera. But like you have this kind of framework in that architecture that allows you to scale right away, and it still keeps it simple enough that you can like be building quickly. So this is a visual of our graph under the hood. This does the cognition of our application. Our application is about solving the epidemic of loneliness through technology. So this chat agent is about getting you out to in-person events where there are people who have your same shared interests. That's what FlockX does. And that's what I work for. And my partner here, Slim, works for SlockX. He does the user experience and product design. And then I'm the CTO and work on technical delivery of the product. So the idea is that we can only truly feel happiness if we produce the hormone oxytocin. That can only be produced in the presence of other humans. There's no pharmaceutical equivalent. There's no like holding puppies. No, we've got to be with other humans in order to create that. So our app is designed to encourage and help people find those shared interest groups and get out there in front of humans. Under the hood to do that, we have this is what we call the supervisor pattern. So this is how we're designing the actual cognition behind the other side of the chat. And that starts with a idea of a primary assistant. That primary assistant is really a router. And so as it receives a chat, a set of the last 7 messages, a summary of the messages before that, and then we have this rolling context that with every turn of conversation, we're having a series of message, summary of the previous message. And then at each of those turns, we're also extracting facts from every single conversation, piece of the conversation. So it knows that my dog is named Oslo. That gets pulled out as a fact and stored into this fact table. Then we inject that fact table into the context as well. Each time we're doing a call to the LLM, and it becomes kind of transformational in how much closer it gets to a conversational agent that feels more like a conversation than some of these non-emotional answers to questions. Because it has this context of your message history, but then also these things it knows about you, is a much more personalized experience. And for us, our tool set is trying to find you that shared interest group. So as we're pulling these facts out, they become the filters to the other tool sets. So whether that's doing a query in Elastic, or that's doing it's something new that we don't know how to work with yet. So it's a raw web search that then brings that back into the context and then is polished into a personality coming out of the graph. So one of the beauties of this setup, and I'll have to run one of these chats through here. Let's see, yeah, each one of these is tied up to this. I think I can actually just run an automate. So this is another tooling that we use to help us build quicker. Instead of me typing those chats in, I actually created a huge file that has messages in them with expected responses and validation criteria. And then I just have like a management command on the server that I can run, and it will go through and start just running through those questions and pushing them into that chat, and then getting the responses, pulling them back, comparing the responses to what I requested for. And I've got an automation that I can be running every time I change prompts, every time I change my application. I can still run through. It's about the closest you can get for test-driven development in an LLM world, right? I'm saying these are the phrases I expect people to ask They're going to ask about one of the things we support a big art festival that's going on right now. We're going to ask questions about the festival. How do you win? How do I vote? How do I find the next piece of art? And so we need to have those questions and know that they're going to be answered accurately and consistently. So you can see right now I've got this, it's going through this file. It's asking these questions. That is the user message, and then it will get an answer. We can just kind of let that run. What it really helps us see is what's in our graph. If we got it running right, let's see. Yeah, put that wrong. We'll run this one and it'll show up in here. And so what this do is fires off and ends up handing off a request into this graph, and it'll start picking up. This is like looking inside your inner dialogue, right? So we can see everything that's happening inside the graph from a cognition perspective. It always takes a second to kind of pick it up. But what you'll end up seeing is inside of this graph, each of the nodes that it hits will kind of light up, and then it'll show you the edges that it's choosing to take. And on this side, we'll see, and on the internet, nobody's having any problems with the internet this time, right? Everyone's internet's perfect. I might have some internet problems too. But so once it picked this up, it'll show like actually how it's going through the process. And we can actually stick ourselves in the middle of each node or edge and change the output from the last to the next node and like rerun it. So we can kind of fork our graph, and it makes for a super rapid iteration cycle, because this graph becomes so complex that like sticking a message in and checking the message on the other side, the iteration of that, when you make a change in the middle and you're not sure exactly what the effect was, being able to go back to each one of those pieces and rerun it from that spot becomes really valuable. If this all looks, oh, this one should load up now. There we go. So this will show you everything that went through the graph, and then it kind of just is just a pretty visualization that it shows where you're at. So this will be the history of the messages that I had existing already. So I have some amount of memory that I'm using that pushes these messages in each time. And so we get down to the last one here. It'll be exactly what I asked this time. I'm visiting Art Prize this coming weekend. Can you help me find the most appropriate 10 artworks for me to see? I've had conversations with this agent, so it knows that like I like paintings more than sculptures, and these things that I've told it. So this walks into the primary assistant, and now this is going to basically be the router for which other assistants it'll choose to use to fulfill the request it's inferring from the context of the conversation at this point. It'll also do some structured extraction. So it rewrites a query for me that's saying, hey, based on my understanding, this is what the intent is, or what we're trying to accomplish for this user. And then I happen to be sharing my geolocation. So it will pull out the latitude and longitude, because that's important for all our Elastic searches where we're trying to find geospatial things in the world. But I can go in here and I could say alter my latitude and longitude and rerun this node, and it would fork off the graph and run this graph from that point onward with my changed data, so that I could then examine how these little minor changes are affecting my graph without changing any code. I'm essentially like changing the data in stream in order to have rapid iteration. Now I can also hand that off to the non-technical parts of my team who know what the conversation is supposed to look like, but they don't know how to write the code. They don't know how to like run the tests. They don't, so they can now iterate in the space that you've created to rapidly get towards better outcomes without having to everyone be the engineer who's writing code. Some people, you got your product people, you've got your QA people, they can operate in a different way with the system. And then another really interesting part of this LangGraph, Langsmith monitoring and observability, which we all kind of put agents in front of, and this becomes the cognition behind them, is we can pop off into Langsmith. And because it's at every single kind of compute point, and particularly each node, it's reporting information back into this observability tool. So I can go and get like all the way deep into how it's making its decisions and step by step examine them, but then I can also add them to a data set have other people come in and annotating them, saying this is a good result, this is a bad result. And that's now automatically in a data set that I can use to push back into a reinforcement learning or into a fine tuning of a smaller model to improve like certain parts. I may have a section in here of tool discovery that I could fine tune a really small, fast model that's just really good at picking from the 5 things I have instead of trying to use like ChatGPT 4.0 for everything. That's going to cost me an arm and a leg. I could have something that's running faster, slicker, and I could be training it from the data that I already used GPT-4 over with users over time to now collect these kind of data sets and run them through fine tuning later on, all piped together already. So I could also like kind of go through all the guts of this and see what exactly happened, what went wrong, what went right. From our architecture, we've got this idea of set of primary assistant and then specialized assistants who know how to do certain types of tasks, either find artwork or help you with a math problem or guide you to the best live music in town. Those are what these specialized assistants do. And then at the end of all that kind of inner dialogue, what we do is we push it out through what we call a personality node, which is essentially a completely different kind of prompt that is talking only about how do you communicate with the people who are really your end users. So how do we give it a bit of personality, a bit of flair? How do we make it less robotic? How do we have it communicate in the kind of culture and style that user is accustomed to, as opposed to everything just being the same? Like it's just the personality of the thing. No, I want it to learn and become more like how I want to communicate. And I want it to remember things about how I want to communicate. So I'm Mark Anthony, but like I'm Tony in my family and I'm Mark everywhere else. My sidekick knows that when I'm talking about work, I'm Mark. And when I'm talking about family stuff, I'm Tony. So those are the kind of nuances that you can get out of kind of having this personality thing out of the end. But all the rest of it is very, logical prompts that say, hey, we want to have these kind of decisions and we want them to be very deterministic. And then put it all through a personality at the end. And that's what we end up going through, one final big giant prompt that stuffs, there's a backstory in there, there's interests, there's, always remember to communicate like this when responding, these kind of instructions on how to respond. And then we give it, a big giant context that's got memory, it's got fact tables in it. And so this is my current fact table. This is like out of my actual conversations with this agent, where it just slowly is picking these items up about me and storing them off. And it will also update them if they change. If I get a new dog, my new dog's name is not Oslo. My new dog's name is Johnny Boy. Then it will update that my dog's name is Johnny Boy. And I'm getting that out of a tool called GetZep, which they have an open source piece and a paid service, but it's fantastic how it's just constantly mining your conversation for facts. So these are kind of like pieces that allow me to rapidly iterate. What would be the kind of, I guess it'd be interesting to see how we change some of this stuff or watch how it selects these tools. Maybe it's better to show it here. So if we look at this in our first primary assistant, it's really its whole mission in life is to route to the other assistants. So essentially we like bind these tools to it and it makes a decision among these, picks one, and then hands off control to that. This was a question about Art Prize. So we have this specialized Art Prize assistant who represents this entire festival. And so once it gets in here, now it can formulate a query specifically about Art Prize to that Art Prize assistant. So basically it's got another set of tools that it can use, which is either this, find out information on the frequently asked questions, search the actual votes, so it can tell you how many times you voted for a piece of art or which piece of art you voted on. And then we always have this default concept of complete or escalate. So if the LLM gets confused, it's always going to escalate back to the primary assistant if it doesn't know what to do. So if it can't pick a tool to use, it escalates back to the primary assistant. So the primary assistant can then hand it off to a potential additional assistant that can fulfill that. So that also helps with chaining these assistants together so that the primary assistant could essentially, for a complex query, say, okay, you want live music and you want to see some artwork. Those are different tools that discover those things. Plan the entire evening that I stop at 2 pieces of artwork, and then I stop at a whiskey bar, then I stop at shopping, and then I go to a wine place, then I vote out another piece of art. So we'll create a set of a list of each of the assistants that it needs to accomplish that task, and then it will pop them in and out on a dialog state. So it's like a FIFO stack that manages the state, and each node across the graph is modifying that state and then passing on. Then the next node is modifying the state. This is that whole Google Pregel paper, if anybody read that, about knowledge graphs. And basically it's an idea of creating applications as a primitive foundational principle being message passing. So ultimately the node puts a message on the state so that the next node has access to the state, but doesn't have, anything at all about the previous nodes. So now it can read these last few messages, know what it's supposed to do, have context, and do it. So that's inside the guts of the graph. It's doing that in the same way that we're doing it at the user interaction level, by keeping the last few messages that we've said to each other and having that part of the personality node that all the messages go out through on the other end. So it picks out a tool here, hands it off to the next tool, and then it will come up with a query. I think that one might have gone through a couple of rotations. It'll come up with that query and put together a prompt, ship it off, and finally, have our message up the other side that's going to go to our user. And it will actually start to, let's see if we've got enough internet to see this stuff going.
You have to go out and back in.
Oh, yeah. Let's see if we get this to, there's any messages in there that might be.
It's definitely another.
Let's see which one. All right, guys, this is the boring part.
I think it's the Gmail we created. The other one.
Yeah. See if we actually see these things coming through.
Box the cycling, the staging.
So here you see it's like actively chatting with itself because I've got that script running behind the scene that's just pumping these messages in, checking the response, and then running a separate process that validates it, that we were achieving what we tried to, that we're consistently, even as we're making changes to code, this is the same as just running a CI environment where you're doing continuous integration and continuous deployment, where you're testing at every single turn of development. This is how we're achieving that in an LLM world, where it's not the same kind of tests you can do, right? Like unit tests, I'm going to get 3 out of there, I'm going to get 3 out of there, right? So here we can kind of watch it happen as well, but then we also have this analysis that's going on under the hood because we're just rotating through these messages and testing the outcomes. So I think we're kind of getting close out of time, but I hope that I was trying to just present some practical tools that can help you move faster, because it's probably not going to be last hackathon. And it's super valuable to have really being well aware and schooled on your tools is as important as any knowledge of any programming language or AI, anything, or systems or networks. Knowing your tools well, knowing your keyboard shortcuts, knowing like how you can set those tools up to help you find problems faster is probably the greatest skill you can ever have in all of engineering, right? And it doesn't matter if it's electrical engineering or software engineering, but knowing how to monitor and see that you're getting the same output consistently, then you know that the changes you're making are doing what you think they're doing, right? It's just like a good controlled test in any kind of scientific experiment. So yeah, this will just keep talking to itself And, behind the scenes, it's logging all these calls and responses, but then lets us check to see that these same questions are improving. So even if we go through a fine tuning loop, where we're using all that data that's stored in Langsmith that I showed you, that's added to data sets. Now we can just run the same, and this is the simplest script ever that does this. It's like, it just reads up and ships messages out to stream chat. And then it like polls to see what the response is. Like it's about the simplest test script I've ever written in my life. But in the context of this LLM world, it has like more value than you would expect to be able to just rerun an entire conversation and see what the outcome is. Any questions? And what do you got?
Right, I was in the back, and how did you get to the flow chart part?
So this is a tool we use called LangGraph Studio. And it's kind of a part, LangGraph is a whole open source thing that's separate from LangChain, but it's the same teams. And like in the context of U agents, this is where we make our U agents, is on these tools down here. And so they become the kind of the agents that are available and can now offload to Agentverse to do tasks or find capabilities that are on Agentverse. With all the rest of it being what I'm calling the cognition part and the tools being the action.
So, I don't know what like this, but we're gonna have to wrap it up right now. So thank you so much for doing this workshop.
You
I
wanna
don't-
do the donations? Do you wanna distribute the donuts?
Yeah.
Just
We
grab
might have to.
I think you can just
them, like,
fans
after
and circle
class,
fans and just
but,
like this.
yeah,
And then,
that'd be great.
Yes.
Thanks so much.
Hopefully it's helpful.
Oh,